Paul's warning: the flesh desires, but the spirit must reign. Few tensions shape the inner life of a believer as relentlessly as the conflict between flesh and spirit. It is not a poetic metaphor, nor a distant theological abstraction. It is a daily, intimate battle that unfolds in thought, desire, intention, and action. The Apostle Paul did not speak of this struggle as a rare crisis reserved for the spiritually weak. He presented it as the defining condition of life for anyone who genuinely seeks to walk with God. His warning is not gentle, and it is not ambiguous. The flesh desires what is contrary to the spirit, and the spirit what is contrary to the flesh. They are in opposition, and neutrality is not an option. Paul's writings dismantle the modern illusion that spiritual growth is merely a matter of self-improvement or moral refinement. He exposes something far more unsettling. The flesh is not simply misguided behavior, but a ruling principle that seeks control. Left unchecked, it does not coexist peacefully with spiritual life. It dominates, reshapes values, dulls discernment, and ultimately resists the reign of God within the human heart. For Paul, the issue is not whether the flesh will desire, because it always will. The real question is whether the Spirit will reign. This message confronts a generation that often confuses grace with comfort and freedom with indulgence. Paul never separated grace from transformation, nor freedom from obedience. His warning was direct: to live according to the flesh is death, not only in the future sense, but in the present experience of spiritual erosion. To live according to the Spirit, however, is life and peace, a reordered inner world where desire no longer dictates destiny. In this teaching, we will explore Paul's warning in depth, not as a historical commentary, but as a living diagnosis of the human condition. We will examine how the flesh operates, why it constantly seeks control, how it disguises itself even within religious language, and what it truly means for the Spirit to reign rather than merely exist as a passive influence. This is not a message of condemnation, but of clarity. Paul's words were written to awaken, not to shame. The conflict is unavoidable. The outcome, however, is not predetermined. The flesh desires, but the Spirit must reign. The nature of the flesh, not a weakness, but a ruling power. Paul's understanding of the flesh goes far beyond physical appetite or moral failure. In his letters, particularly in Romans and Galatians, the flesh is described as a governing orientation of life, a power that exerts influence over perception, motivation, and allegiance. This distinction is critical because many misunderstand the battle by reducing the flesh to isolated sins, rather than recognizing it as an internal authority that seeks to rule. When Paul speaks of the flesh, he is not condemning the human body itself. The body, in his theology, is capable of becoming a temple of the Holy Spirit. The flesh, rather, represents a self-centered mode of existence, one that defines reality without reference to God. It is life interpreted through self-interest, self-protection, and self-exaltation. This is why the flesh can appear disciplined, religious, or even morally upright while still being fundamentally opposed to the Spirit. The danger of the flesh lies in its subtlety. It does not always tempt through obvious rebellion. Often it asserts itself through control, fear, pride, and the insistence on autonomy. The flesh wants to decide what is acceptable, what is reasonable, and what is necessary. It resists surrender not because surrender is painful, but because surrender threatens its authority. In this sense, the flesh is less about desire for pleasure and more about desire for dominance. Paul's language is deliberate when he says that the flesh sets its mind on certain things. This is not a passive inclination, it is an intentional focus. The flesh organizes life around what is immediately gratifying, socially affirmed, or emotionally safe. It seeks predictability and power. even if those come at the cost of spiritual vitality. This is why the flesh often reacts strongly against silence, waiting, and trust, because these practices expose its lack of control. Another crucial insight in Paul's warning is that the flesh cannot be reformed into submission. It cannot be negotiated with or gradually persuaded to cooperate with the Spirit. Paul does not advise managing the flesh. He speaks of putting it to death. This language shocks modern sensibilities, but it reveals a truth that experience confirms. The flesh will always seek more ground. Any concession becomes a foothold. The flesh also has an uncanny ability to use religious behavior as camouflage. It can pursue spiritual activities for the sake of recognition, security, or superiority. It can turn obedience into performance and discipline into identity. In such cases, the flesh is not defeated, it is merely baptized. Paul's warning cuts through this deception by insisting that the true measure of spiritual life is not external compliance, but internal alignment with the Spirit's leading. One of the most sobering aspects of Paul's teaching is his assertion that the flesh is hostile to God. This hostility does not always express itself through anger or disbelief. More often, it manifests as resistance to God's timing, methods, and authority. The flesh may acknowledge God in theory while rejecting his rule in practice. It prefers a God who affirms rather than transforms, who assists rather than commands. Understanding the flesh as a ruling power explains why good intentions alone are insufficient. Many sincerely desire spiritual growth while remaining internally governed by fear, habit, or self-reliance. Paul's message is not that desire is irrelevant, but that desire must be reoriented. As long as the flesh defines what is desirable, spiritual life remains constrained. The conflict Paul describes is therefore not between bad people and good people, but between two ways of living, two sources of authority. The flesh says, "I decide." The Spirit says, "Submit and live." This is why the battle feels so personal. It strikes at the core of identity and control. Paul's warning is not meant to instill despair, but to clarify the stakes. The flesh desires constantly, persistently, and creatively. It will not cease its efforts. The only question is whether it will be allowed to reign. The Spirit does not force domination. He invites surrender. Where surrender is withheld, the flesh fills the vacuum. If this message resonates with you, it is because the battle is real and ongoing. To continue exploring how the Spirit reigns, how victory is lived out daily, and how Paul's warning becomes a pathway to freedom rather than fear, make sure you are subscribed to the channel. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next part of this teaching, where we go deeper into how the Spirit actively transforms desire itself, not just behavior. The conflict of desires. Why the flesh and the Spirit cannot coexist as equals. Paul does not describe the struggle between flesh and spirit as a temporary imbalance or a phase of immaturity. He presents it as an ongoing conflict rooted in opposing desires, not merely opposing actions. This distinction is essential. Actions are the visible outcome, but desires are the hidden engine. Whoever governs desire governs the direction of life. That is why Paul does not say that the flesh occasionally interferes with the Spirit, but that the flesh desires what is contrary to the Spirit, and the Spirit what is contrary to the flesh. They are not misaligned partners. They are rival authorities. The modern tendency is to believe that balance is the solution. Many imagine a spiritual life where fleshly desires are moderated, managed, or kept in check, while spiritual aspirations occupy a parallel space. Paul dismantles this idea completely. For him, coexistence is impossible, because the flesh and the Spirit do not aim at different versions of the same life. They aim at fundamentally different ends. One seeks self-rule, the other surrender. One prioritizes immediate preservation and gratification, the other eternal alignment and transformation. Balance, in this context, is not wisdom, but indecision. The flesh desires comfort without cost, power without dependence, and identity without surrender. Even when it desires good outcomes, it insists on being the source and the controller of those outcomes. The spirit, on the other hand, desires conformity to God's will, even when that path involves discomfort, waiting, or apparent loss. This is why the conflict feels so intense. It is not simply about resisting temptation, it is about relinquishing control over what defines success, safety, and meaning. Paul's language of desire is deliberate because desire shapes perception. What we desire determines what we notice, what we fear, and what we justify. When the flesh dominates desire, spiritual disciplines feel restrictive, obedience feels heavy, and trust feels risky. When the Spirit reigns, the same practices are experienced as freedom, alignment, and life. The external behavior may appear similar, but the internal orientation is entirely different. Paul understood that transformation does not begin with behavior modification, but with the redirection of desire. One of the most misunderstood aspects of this conflict is that the flesh does not always desire what is obviously sinful. Often, it desires what is reasonable, socially acceptable, and even admirable. It may desire success, recognition, stability, or influence. None of these are inherently evil, yet they become tools of the flesh when they are pursued as ultimate sources of identity or security. The flesh is not exposed by the object of desire alone, but by the refusal to release that desire to God's authority. This is why Paul insists that those who live according to the flesh cannot please God. This statement is often interpreted morally, as if Paul were saying that imperfect people fail to meet divine standards. What he is actually saying is far more structural. To live according to the flesh is to operate from a system that excludes God's rule. Even when outward behavior appears compliant, the governing desire remains self-centered. Pleasing God is not about flawless performance, but about rightful authority. The Spirit's desire, in contrast, is not centered on suppressing pleasure or enforcing austerity. The Spirit desires life, but life defined by truth rather than impulse. The Spirit reshapes desire so that what once felt restrictive becomes desirable, and what once felt urgent loses its power. This transformation does not happen instantly, which is why the conflict persists even in mature believers. Paul himself acknowledges this tension, not as a confession of failure, but as an honest recognition of the process of sanctification. A critical danger arises when believers misinterpret the persistence of the conflict as evidence that spiritual growth is not happening. Paul never suggests that the absence of struggle is the mark of spiritual maturity. On the contrary, heightened awareness of the conflict often indicates increased sensitivity to the Spirit. The flesh resists most fiercely where it is losing ground. The presence of tension does not mean the Spirit is absent. It often means the Spirit is actively challenging established patterns of control. The flesh attempts to resolve this tension by demanding immediate relief. It pushes toward distraction, rationalization, or compromise. The Spirit, however, invites endurance. Paul frequently links spiritual life with patience, perseverance, and hope, not because the Spirit is passive, but because lasting transformation requires time under truth. The flesh wants resolution without refinement. The Spirit values refinement over relief. Another crucial insight in Paul's teaching is that the conflict of desires cannot be resolved through external law alone. Paul's own journey demonstrates this truth. The law can restrain behavior, but it cannot transform desire. In fact, Paul argues that law can sometimes intensify fleshly desire by provoking rebellion or self-righteousness. The Spirit works differently. Rather than imposing restraint from the outside, the Spirit reorders desire from within. This is why Paul emphasizes walking by the Spirit rather than striving against the flesh. Walking implies movement, direction, and relationship. It is not a momentary decision, but an ongoing posture. To walk by the Spirit is to continually submit decision-making, interpretation, and response to God's presence. This posture does not eliminate desire, but it redirects it. Over time, what once felt irresistible loses its urgency, and what once felt unappealing gains depth and meaning. This gradual shift is one of the most reliable signs that the Spirit is reigning rather than merely being acknowledged. The flesh resists this process by appealing to urgency. It frames desires as immediate needs, convincing the individual that waiting is dangerous or unnecessary. The Spirit counters urgency with trust. Paul repeatedly connects spiritual life with faith, not as abstract belief, but as practical reliance. Faith accepts delay without anxiety, because it trusts the character of God rather than the timing of circumstances. Paul's warning becomes especially relevant when believers attempt to use spiritual language to justify fleshly desires. The flesh is adept at borrowing the vocabulary of faith while maintaining control of direction. It can spiritualize ambition, excuse impatience as discernment, and label fear as wisdom. Paul's writings expose these tactics by returning repeatedly to the question of fruit. Desire governed by the Spirit produces qualities such as peace, patience, self-control, and love. Desire governed by the flesh produces fragmentation, anxiety, comparison, and eventual exhaustion, even when outward success is achieved. The conflict between flesh and spirit is therefore not resolved through willpower alone. Willpower can suppress behavior temporarily, but it cannot sustain transformation. Paul's emphasis on the Spirit acknowledges that lasting change requires a new source of desire. This is why he speaks of being led by the Spirit rather than mastering the flesh. Leadership implies trust, responsiveness, and humility, qualities the flesh resists because they diminish its authority. One of the most sobering truths in Paul's warning is that indecision ultimately favors the flesh. The Spirit does not force control. Where the believer hesitates, delays, or compartmentalizes, the flesh fills the space by default. This is not because the flesh is stronger, but because it is more aggressive in asserting itself. The Spirit invites reign, the flesh demands it. The outcome depends on which voice is obeyed consistently over time. Paul's message is not meant to create fear, but clarity. The conflict of desires will not disappear through neglect or compromise. It must be engaged consciously and continuously. The good news Paul offers is that the Spirit is not weaker than the flesh. The Spirit does not merely resist, he transforms. But transformation requires consent. The reign of the Spirit begins where the believer stops negotiating control. If you recognize this conflict within yourself, that recognition itself is significant. Awareness is often the first sign that the Spirit is already at work, exposing what once operated unnoticed. To continue walking through Paul's warning and to understand how the Spirit not only confronts desire, but reshapes identity itself, make sure you are subscribed to the channel. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next part of this teaching, where we will explore how the Spirit establishes authority not through force, but through truth that sets the inner life free. The illusion of freedom. How the flesh promises life but delivers bondage. Paul's warning reaches one of its most penetrating depths when he exposes the flesh as a false liberator. One of the greatest deceptions of the flesh is not that it openly opposes God, but that it presents itself as the pathway to freedom. It whispers that obedience restricts, that surrender diminishes individuality, and that self-rule is the highest form of life. Paul dismantles this illusion relentlessly. According to him, the flesh does not produce freedom at all. It produces a subtle and progressive form of bondage that often goes unrecognized until its effects are deeply entrenched. The flesh equates freedom with the absence of restraint. It defines liberty as the ability to act on impulse, desire, or preference without interference. This definition feels intuitive, especially in cultures that celebrate autonomy and self-expression. Yet Paul's experience and teaching reveal that unrestrained desire does not lead to expansion, but to narrowing. The more the flesh is obeyed, the more it demands. What begins as choice gradually becomes compulsion. What feels like freedom at first slowly becomes necessity. Paul speaks openly about slavery, not as metaphorical exaggeration, but as a spiritual reality. He insists that everyone serves something. The question is not whether a person is free from all authority, but which authority governs their life. The flesh presents itself as self-rule, but in practice it enslaves the individual to patterns, fears and desires that grow stronger through indulgence. The Spirit, by contrast, introduces submission, yet produces genuine freedom because it liberates the person from domination by impulse. One of the most dangerous aspects of the flesh's promise is that it often delivers short-term relief. It eases tension, distracts from discomfort, and offers immediate satisfaction. This is why its voice feels persuasive in moments of fatigue, uncertainty, or emotional pain. Paul does not deny that the flesh can produce temporary pleasure. His warning is that such pleasure is shallow and unsustainable. It requires repetition, escalation, and eventually sacrifice of integrity, peace, or clarity to maintain. Over time, the flesh trains the mind to equate relief with survival. This conditioning reshapes priorities. Decisions are made not based on truth or long-term alignment, but on what alleviates discomfort most quickly. Paul recognizes this mechanism and counters it by emphasizing endurance and hope. These qualities are not valued by the flesh because they delay gratification, but they are essential for spiritual freedom because they break the cycle of compulsion. The illusion deepens when the flesh begins to define identity. Instead of being something one experiences, desire becomes something one is. Preferences turn into labels, struggles become self-descriptions, and temporary states are treated as permanent truths. Paul challenges this directly by grounding identity not in behavior or desire, but in belonging. To be in the Spirit is not merely to act differently, but to understand oneself as governed by a new reality. This shift is foundational. Without it, attempts at change remain superficial and exhausting. Another critical element of Paul's warning is that the flesh thrives in isolation. It convinces the individual that their desires are private, unique, or beyond understanding. This secrecy intensifies bondage because unexamined desire gains strength. The Spirit, however, draws the believer into truth, light, and community. Paul repeatedly emphasizes confession, mutual accountability, and shared growth, not as moral policing, but as liberation from the isolating grip of the flesh. The flesh also manipulates the concept of authenticity. It claims that resisting desire is dishonest, that expressing impulse is integrity. Paul exposes this inversion by redefining authenticity not as unfiltered expression, but as alignment with truth. A desire can be genuine without being good. Authenticity without discernment becomes surrender to impulse. The Spirit does not deny authenticity. He refines it by distinguishing between passing urges and enduring values. Paul's own testimony underscores the tragedy of mistaking knowledge for freedom. He was deeply educated, morally disciplined, and religiously committed, yet internally divided and driven by forces he did not fully understand. His encounter with Christ did not remove desire instantly, but it revealed its true nature. What he once interpreted as strength, he began to recognize as bondage. What he once defended, he learned to surrender. This transformation did not make him passive, it made him free. A key insight in Paul's teaching is that the flesh resists naming its bondage. It reframes dependency as preference, habit as personality, and compulsion as choice. The Spirit disrupts these narratives by introducing truth that feels uncomfortable at first. Freedom begins not when desire disappears, but when deception is exposed. This exposure often feels like loss because familiar coping mechanisms are challenged. Paul acknowledges this pain, but insists it leads to life. The flesh also fuels fear of surrender by exaggerating what will be lost. It presents obedience as erasure, holiness as emptiness, and discipline as deprivation. Paul counters this by consistently pointing to the fruit of the Spirit. Peace, joy, self-control, and love are not abstract ideals. They are experiential realities that emerge when the Spirit reigns. These qualities are not imposed. They grow naturally when desire is reordered. One of the most subtle forms of bondage Paul identifies is the cycle of self-effort. The flesh often attempts to escape its own excesses through increased control, discipline, or moral resolve. While these efforts may produce temporary improvement, they often reinforce the flesh's central illusion that control belongs to the self. Paul insists that freedom does not come from trying harder, but from yielding more deeply. This message confronts pride and fear simultaneously, which is why it is so often resisted. Paul's warning also addresses the emotional toll of flesh-driven living. Anxiety, restlessness, comparison, and dissatisfaction are not incidental side effects. They are symptoms of a system built on instability. The flesh constantly recalculates, competes, and protects. The Spirit introduces rest, not by removing responsibility, but by anchoring life in something unchanging. This anchoring allows the believer to act without being consumed by outcome. The illusion of freedom collapses most clearly over time. Patterns that once felt liberating become exhausting. Desires that once energized begin to drain. Paul speaks of this as corruption, not in a moralistic sense, but as deterioration. The flesh cannot sustain life because it feeds on itself. The Spirit, however, draws from an eternal source. This difference explains why spiritual life, though demanding, becomes lighter with maturity, while flesh-driven living becomes heavier. Paul does not present this contrast to induce fear, but discernment. True freedom is not the ability to do whatever one wants, but the capacity to do what is right without inner resistance. This capacity grows as the Spirit reigns. It does not eliminate struggle entirely, but it transforms struggle from chaotic resistance into purposeful discipline. If you are listening and recognize the weight of desires that once promised freedom but now demand energy, attention, and compromise, Paul's warning is not condemnation. It is an invitation. The Spirit does not shame, he liberates, but liberation requires honesty about what has been ruling. To continue this journey and to understand how the Spirit establishes lasting freedom by reshaping the inner will rather than merely suppressing behavior, make sure you are subscribed to the channel. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next part of this teaching, where we will explore how the Spirit forms a new inner authority that replaces fear and compulsion with clarity and peace. The reign of the Spirit, authority, surrender, and the reshaping of the inner life. Paul's warning reaches its turning point when he moves from exposing the flesh to describing the reign of the Spirit. This transition is crucial because Paul is not merely interested in diagnosis, he is concerned with governance. The question is never simply whether the flesh is present, but whether it rules. Likewise, the Spirit is not presented as an optional influence, a comforting presence added to an otherwise self-directed life. The Spirit must reign. Anything less than reign leaves the structure of the inner life unchanged, even if behavior improves temporarily. To speak of reign is to speak of authority. Paul understood authority not as oppression, but as order. Every life operates under some organizing principle. When the flesh reigns, life is ordered around impulse, fear, self-protection, and control. When the Spirit reigns, life is ordered around truth, trust, obedience, and alignment with God. The difference is not cosmetic, it is foundational. Authority determines direction, priority, and interpretation of experience. One of the most challenging truths Paul presents is that the Spirit does not seize authority by force. Unlike the flesh, which aggressively asserts itself, the Spirit governs through consent. This is why Paul consistently speaks in terms of yielding, walking, living, and being led. These verbs imply relationship rather than coercion. The Spirit reigns where he is welcomed as Lord, not merely acknowledged as helper. This distinction explains why many believers experience spiritual awareness without transformation. Awareness without surrender leaves authority untouched. Surrender, in Paul's theology, is not passive resignation. It is an active transfer of trust. To surrender to the Spirit is to relinquish the illusion that one knows what is best, safest, or most fulfilling in every situation. This is profoundly unsettling to the flesh, because the flesh equates control with survival. The Spirit challenges this equation by revealing that true life flows not from control, but from alignment with God's wisdom, which often contradicts instinct and habit. Paul emphasizes that the reign of the Spirit reshapes the inner life before it reshapes circumstances. This is why spiritual maturity is not measured by the absence of difficulty, but by the presence of peace within difficulty. When the Spirit reigns, reactions change before situations do. Fear loses its authority to dictate decisions. Desire no longer demands immediate satisfaction. Offense no longer controls identity. This internal reordering is the clearest evidence that authority has shifted. One of the flesh's strongest defenses against the reign of the Spirit is the belief that surrender leads to loss. Loss of identity, loss of ambition, loss of enjoyment, loss of self. Paul confronts this fear directly by reframing what is actually lost. What is lost is not life, but illusion. The illusion of autonomy, the illusion of self-sufficiency, the illusion that fulfillment can be engineered apart from God. What is gained, though often slowly, is coherence. Life begins to make sense internally, even when externally complex. Paul's language of being in the Spirit is not mystical abstraction. It describes a lived reality in which the Spirit becomes the primary reference point for interpretation. Thoughts are filtered differently. Emotions are examined rather than obeyed blindly. Desires are questioned rather than assumed to be authoritative. This does not mean emotional numbness or suppression. It means integration. The Spirit does not erase emotion. He orders it. A critical aspect of the Spirit's reign is the development of discernment. When the flesh rules, discernment is replaced by justification. The question becomes, how can I defend what I already want? Under the Spirit's reign, the question shifts to, what is true, even if it challenges what I want? This shift changes decision-making at every level. Small choices begin to reflect long-term values rather than short-term relief. Paul also emphasizes that the Spirit's authority produces fruit, not strain. This is one of the most misunderstood elements of spiritual life. Many assume that surrender leads to constant effort and pressure. Paul teaches the opposite. When authority is rightly placed, effort becomes purposeful rather than frantic. Obedience flows from alignment rather than fear. Discipline becomes a means of protection rather than punishment. The fruit of the Spirit is not something the believer manufactures. It emerges naturally when the Spirit reigns. Love replaces defensiveness. Peace replaces internal chaos. Patience replaces urgency. Self-control replaces compulsion. These qualities cannot be sustained through willpower alone. They are evidence that desire itself is being reshaped. Paul's insistence on fruit is intentional. Fruit reveals the health of the root. Behavior may be managed, but fruit grows. Another profound implication of the Spirit's reign is the restoration of perspective. The flesh interprets life through immediacy. It magnifies present discomfort and minimizes long-term consequence. The Spirit expands vision. Paul frequently connects life in the Spirit with hope, not as wishful thinking, but as confident expectation grounded in God's faithfulness. Hope allows the believer to endure tension without being ruled by it. Paul's own life demonstrates that the reign of the Spirit does not eliminate struggle, but it does eliminate confusion about allegiance. Even when Paul speaks of internal conflict, he is clear about where authority lies. He no longer identifies with the flesh as his true self. This shift in identity is critical. When struggle is no longer mistaken for identity, shame loses its power. The believer can confront weakness without self-condemnation because authority is anchored elsewhere. The flesh resists this identity shift because it thrives on ambiguity. As long as the believer is unsure who they are and who rules, the flesh can negotiate influence. The Spirit brings clarity. Paul repeatedly affirms that those led by the Spirit are sons and daughters of God, not slaves. This language is intentional. Sonship implies inheritance, security, and belonging. Slavery implies fear, performance, and instability. Authority determines which experience dominates. One of the most transformative effects of the Spirit's reign is the redefinition of strength. Under the flesh, strength is self-assertion, independence, and resilience through control. Under the Spirit, strength is trust, obedience, and endurance without bitterness. This inversion challenges deeply ingrained assumptions. Paul's insistence that God's power is perfected in weakness makes no sense to the flesh, yet it becomes undeniable through lived experience when surrender produces peace rather than collapse. The reign of the Spirit also reshapes how believers relate to failure. Under the flesh, failure threatens identity and provokes either despair or denial. Under the Spirit, failure becomes information rather than condemnation. It reveals areas where surrender is incomplete, not areas where worth is lost. This distinction allows growth without paralysis. Paul's warning loses its terror when understood through the lens of grace-driven authority rather than performance-driven fear. Importantly, Paul does not present the Spirit's reign as a one-time event. It is a daily, ongoing reality. Authority is reaffirmed through repeated choices to trust, obey, and yield. This does not mean constant anxiety about perfection. It means consistency of direction. The Spirit reigns where the believer repeatedly returns to truth, even after missteps. The flesh attempts to counter this by promoting fatigue and resignation. It suggests that surrender is too costly, too slow, too demanding. Paul counters this narrative by pointing to transformation over time. What once required effort gradually becomes instinctive. Peace becomes familiar. Discernment sharpens, desire aligns. This progression is not dramatic, but it is profound. Paul's warning, therefore, is not merely about avoiding destruction. It is about embracing rightful order. The Spirit must reign not because God is insecure, but because the human soul cannot flourish under fragmented authority. Life requires a center. The flesh cannot provide it because it is reactive and unstable. The Spirit provides it because He anchors life in truth that does not change with circumstance. If you sense that your spiritual life has been marked by effort without rest, discipline without joy, or awareness without transformation, Paul's message is an invitation to reconsider authority. The Spirit does not ask for partial influence. He asks for reign. To continue with the final and most decisive part of this teaching, where we will explore how walking in the Spirit becomes a lived, daily reality rather than an abstract ideal, make sure you are subscribed to the channel. Subscribe now so you don't miss Topic 5, where Paul's warning reaches its fulfillment in a life marked not by conflict alone, but by enduring freedom and peace. Walking by the Spirit. How the inner war becomes a life of enduring freedom. Paul does not end his warning with struggle. He does not leave the believer suspended in tension, endlessly battling desire without resolution. His final emphasis is not merely on resisting the flesh, but on walking by the Spirit. This shift is decisive. The goal is not constant warfare as an identity, but transformation so deep that the war loses its power to dominate the inner life. Walking by the Spirit is how the reign of the Spirit becomes practical, daily, and enduring. To walk by the Spirit is to live from a new center. Paul intentionally uses the language of walking rather than fighting, suppressing, or controlling. Walking implies rhythm, direction, and continuity. It suggests a life that moves forward steadily rather than one that is consumed by reaction. When a person walks by the Spirit, the flesh does not disappear, but it no longer sets the pace. The Spirit determines direction, and desire gradually follows. One of the most important truths Paul communicates is that walking by the Spirit is proactive, not reactive. Many believers approach spiritual life defensively, focusing on what must be avoided, resisted, or escaped. Paul reframes the focus. When the Spirit leads, attention shifts from avoidance to alignment. Instead of asking, "How do I stop doing this?" the question becomes, "Where is the Spirit leading me now?" This change in focus weakens the flesh because it thrives on fixation and fear. Walking by the Spirit requires attentiveness. It is not automatic. Paul does not suggest that spiritual maturity eliminates the need for awareness. On the contrary, awareness deepens. The difference is that awareness is no longer anxious. The believer becomes sensitive to inner movements without being controlled by them. Thoughts are noticed, emotions are acknowledged, desires are examined. None of these are obeyed blindly. The Spirit introduces a pause between impulse and action, and in that pause, freedom grows. A critical element of walking by the Spirit is learning to trust truth over feeling. The flesh equates intensity with importance. Whatever feels strongest must be addressed immediately. The Spirit teaches discernment. Not every strong feeling carries authority. Not every desire deserves action. Paul understood that emotional intensity often reflects conditioning rather than truth. Walking by the Spirit trains the believer to evaluate inner experiences rather than submit to them. This evaluation does not produce detachment or coldness. It produces clarity. When the Spirit reigns, emotions are integrated rather than suppressed. Joy becomes deeper because it is not dependent on circumstances. Grief becomes honest without becoming despair. Anger becomes information rather than identity. Fear becomes a signal rather than a command. This emotional maturity is one of the clearest signs that the Spirit is actively governing the inner life. Paul also emphasizes that walking by the Spirit reshapes time. The flesh lives in urgency. Everything feels immediate, critical, and threatening. The Spirit introduces patience, not passive waiting, but confident endurance. This patience is grounded in trust that God is at work beyond what is immediately visible. As patience grows, anxiety loses leverage. Decisions become less reactive. Life slows internally, even when externally demanding. Another profound transformation that occurs when walking by the Spirit is the redefinition of success. Under the flesh, success is measured by outcome, recognition, or control. Under the Spirit, success is measured by faithfulness, obedience, and alignment. This does not eliminate ambition, but it purifies it. Goals are pursued without obsession. Effort is invested without identity attachment. Failure loses its power to define worth. Paul's teaching also makes clear that walking by the Spirit produces consistency rather than perfection. The flesh thrives on extremes, cycles of indulgence followed by guilt, intensity followed by collapse. The Spirit cultivates steadiness. Spiritual life becomes less dramatic, but more reliable. This steadiness is often misunderstood as stagnation, but it is actually maturity. The inner life stabilizes because authority is settled. One of the greatest freedoms Paul describes is freedom from self-obsession. The flesh is relentlessly self-referential. It monitors performance, compares progress, and interprets everything through personal impact. Walking by the Spirit gradually shifts attention outward. Love becomes less conditional. Service becomes less transactional. Relationships become less competitive. This outward orientation is not self-neglect, it is self-forgetfulness, which Paul understood as a mark of genuine freedom. Walking by the Spirit also transforms how believers relate to temptation. Temptation does not vanish, but it loses its mystique. It is no longer viewed as irresistible or defining. Paul's teaching reveals that temptation derives much of its power from secrecy and exaggeration. When the Spirit reigns, temptation is brought into the light of truth. Its promises are examined. Its costs are acknowledged. Its urgency is exposed. In this clarity, temptation weakens. Importantly, Paul does not present walking by the Spirit as isolation from the body of believers. The Spirit's reign naturally draws individuals into healthy community, not because community enforces behavior, but because it reinforces truth. Shared life exposes blind spots, encourages perseverance, and normalizes growth. The flesh isolates to protect its narratives. The Spirit connects to strengthen alignment. Another decisive change Paul describes is how the believer responds to inner failure. Under the flesh, failure triggers shame or defiance. Under the Spirit, failure leads to repentance without despair. Repentance, in Paul's understanding, is not self-punishment. It is recalibration. Authority is reaffirmed. Direction is corrected. The journey continues. This ability to recover quickly without self-condemnation is a hallmark of walking by the Spirit. Paul also makes clear that walking by the Spirit produces resilience, not the brittle resilience of self-reliance, but the flexible resilience of trust. When circumstances shift, the believer is not destabilized internally. Peace remains accessible. Hope remains grounded. This resilience is not rooted in optimism, but in assurance that life is anchored beyond immediate conditions. Over time, walking by the Spirit transforms desire itself. This is perhaps the most misunderstood and most liberating promise in Paul's warning. The flesh tells us that desire must always be fought. Paul reveals that desire can be healed. As the Spirit reigns, what once felt compelling loses appeal. What once felt restrictive becomes natural. This transformation is gradual, often unnoticed in the moment, but unmistakable in hindsight. The inner war does not end through exhaustion or victory over the flesh by force. It ends through the establishment of a new normal. The Spirit becomes the default reference point. Obedience becomes less costly. Trust becomes less frightening. Identity becomes more stable. The flesh still speaks, but its voice is no longer authoritative. Paul's warning, when fully understood, is not a threat, but an invitation. The flesh desires, but it does not have to reign. The Spirit reigns, not through domination, but through truth that sets the inner life free. Walking by the Spirit is not an abstract ideal reserved for the spiritually elite. It is the lived reality of anyone willing to surrender authority consistently, imperfectly, but sincerely. If you have followed this teaching and recognize that something within you longs, not just for restraint, but for freedom, then Paul's message has done its work. The invitation is clear. Do not merely acknowledge the Spirit. Walk by Him. Let Him reign. If this teaching has spoken to you and you want to continue exploring how spiritual truth reshapes daily life in practical, transformative ways, make sure you are subscribed to the channel. Subscribe now so you don't miss future teachings that will help you walk in clarity, freedom, and enduring peace.